All right, welcome to the first lecture of Phil 7 of winter 2023. So I filmed some of these this year and last year around town, mostly at the beaches around Santa Barbara. Today I'm here at East Beach, and yeah, I hope you enjoy the beautiful scenery and background as I go over my notes in the bioethics. All right, so the first thing we should probably do is start off with some terms so we make sure we're all using the same vocabulary. So first, morality is a broad concept, and it generally includes people's morals, judgments, principles, rules, standards, and theories. So sometimes we also use morality in this general sense, but sometimes we use it in a more specific sense to be talking about a person's views or a group of people's views on morality. For example, like American morality or Kant's morality. We also sometimes use morality to be synonymous with good and immorality to be synonymous with bad. Okay, so according to the textbook, this is like kind of a stricter definition. Not everyone totally agrees with this, but morality and ethics are supposed to be distinct from one another. Morality is more this broader concept, and ethics is more this narrow concept. All right, so the textbook defines ethics as the study of morality using the tools and methods of philosophy. And philosophy is a discipline that systematically examines life's big questions through critical reasoning, logical arguments, and careful reflection. Thus, we get a bigger picture of what ethics is. It's also known as moral philosophy. It is a reasoned way of delving into the meaning and import of moral concepts and issues, and of evaluating the merits of moral judgments and their standards. All right, so that gives us kind of a clear picture of what ethics is, but it can also be helpful to look at the questions that ethics is trying to answer. Like all philosophic branches, it's centered around the questions. So here are some of the questions that ethics is trying to answer. Whether an action is right or wrong, what moral standard should guide our conduct, what moral principle can be justified, what moral values are worth cultivating and why, what ultimate ends people should pursue in life, whether there are good reasons for accepting a particular moral theory, what the meaning is of such notions as right, wrong, good, or bad. So whenever you're critically thinking about any of these kinds of questions, like, you're going to be entering the world of ethics. So in contrast to moral philosophy or ethics, we also have descriptive ethics. So descriptive ethics is the study of morality, but it's going to be more using the methods and approaches of science. So some anthropologists or sociologists or historians or psychologists aim to study the empirical facts about behaviors, beliefs, and particular or practices of moralities. Okay, so again, it's good to distinguish them by their questions. So descriptive ethics, they're going to be asking the questions of what moral beliefs a person or group has, what causes the subject to have them, how the beliefs influence behaviors or social interactions. All right, so like a quick way of summing up the difference here is that descriptive ethics is concerned with how we should live our lives, while moral philosophy is concerned with how we ought to live our lives. Okay, so ethics is one of the three main branches of philosophy, the other two being metaphysics and epistemology. But then ethics itself can be divided up into three sub-branches. First, you have normative ethics. This is considered the search for and the justification of moral standards and norms. So the main aim of this branch is to provide a rational basis for some or all of the proper guidance for actions and judgments. They usually try and establish this through principles, rules, virtues, or theories. we will look at all these different theories in the next lecture. That's what's coming up next. But here are just some of the questions that are going to be in the realm of normative ethics. So what moral principles, if any, should inform our moral judgments? What role should virtue play in our lives? Is the principle of autonomy justified? Are there any exceptions to the moral principle, do not kill? How should we resolve conflicts between moral norms? Is contractarianism a good moral theory? Is utilitarianism a better theory? All right, so the next major moral branch of ethics we're going to look at is called metaethics. Actually, we're not going to look at this. This is just the next major branch. So this is the study of meaning and justification of basic moral beliefs. So in normative ethics, the one we were just talking about, they might have asked whether an action is right or wrong or whether a person is good or bad. But here in contrast, in metaethics, they would ask what it means for an action to be right or what it means for a person to be good. So the focus of this branch of ethics is the deep fundamental questions. And some of the more examples of these fundamental questions are, does right mean the best consequences, or does right mean that it produces the best happiness, or does right mean that it was what was commanded by God? That would be a metaethical question. What, if any, is the difference between moral and non-moral beliefs? Are there such things as moral facts? If so, what sorts of things are they? And how can we know them? Can moral statements be true or false? Or are they just expressions of emotions or attitudes without any true value? Can moral norms be justified or proven? All right, so the third branch of ethics that there is applied ethics. So the main focus of this branch is using the moral norms and concepts to resolve practical moral issues. So it's taking the principles from the normative theories in branch 1, that were justified through the metaethical reasoning in branch 2, and then they're going to apply them to actual situations. So many of these practical moral issues arise in fields such as law, business, or journalism, and so there are corresponding fields in business ethics, legal ethics, and journalistic ethics. And one of the largest subfields in applied ethics is going to be bioethics. So bioethics, which is going to be the focus of this class, is applied ethics focused on healthcare, medical science, and medical technologies. So here are just some of the questions that we are going to get into this quarter. Is abortion ever morally permissible? Is a woman justified in having abortion if prenatal genetic testing reveals that her fetus has a developmental defect? Should people be allowed to select embryos, sex, or other genetic characteristics? Should human embryos ever be used in medical research? Should severely impaired newborns be given life-prolonging treatment or be allowed to die? Should people in persistent vegetative states be removed from life support? Should physicians help terminally ill patients commit suicide? Is it morally right to conduct medical research on patients without their consent if the research can save lives? Should human stem cell research be banned? How should we decide who gets life-saving organ transplants when usable organs are scarce and many patients who will not get transplants will die? All right, now with like a clearer understanding of what bioethics is and where it fits into philosophy and how philosophy interacts here with biomedicine, you might be thinking like, why should I be taking this class? Well, dealing with moral issues at some point in your life are just inevitable, specifically bioethical things. Whether it's you or someone else or a close one, loved one, you're going to be experiencing a lot of these issues. On top of that, these issues are very heavy topics. Some people call them weighty. Many of them are right on the border between life and death, or health and illness, or pain and relief, or hope and despair. Okay, and so since, these are such heavy topics, it's good for us to, carefully think through them before we're stuck in the middle of one of these topics. And hopefully thinking about these beforehand will, help you give some grounding and help you, give some guidance in how to think about these issues and how you want to, move forward. So yeah, I hope that's the main takeaway that you get from this class, and yeah. So morality is concerned with certain standards and norms, but not just any standards and norms. It's specifically concerned with moral standards and norms. Again, that could be contrasted with aesthetic norms, etiquette norms, grammatical norms, legal norms, but moral norms are going to differ in 4 important ways. So moral norms are going to have normative dominance, which means that they're going to take precedent or override other norms. For example, there might be some aesthetic norm or pragmatic norm that says, homeless people shouldn't be allowed to sleep in front of a public mural. But, that norm would have to yield to the norm that we should, the moral norm that we should respect the unhoused people. Right, so the second feature of moral norms is universality. So moral norms apply in all relevantly similar situations. So this is really just a matter of logical consistency. If it's wrong for someone to do X in context C, then it should likewise be wrong for someone else to do X in relevantly similar context. So this universality isn't particularly just a feature of moral norms, but it's definitely a feature of moral norms. It's also a feature of other norms as well, for sure. Okay, so impartiality is the third feature of moral norms. So this is the idea that everyone should be considered as equals, and everyone's interests should be counted equally. So everyone's interests should be counted, or everyone should be treated as equals, but there can also be instances of morally relevant differences that can explain why we would treat one person differently than another. Okay, so impartiality is meant to be a prohibition against discrimination against people merely because of some morally irrelevant difference, such as a difference over skin color, weight, gender, income, occupation, and so on. However, some are morally relevant, and they can explain why we do have a moral responsibility to help one person as opposed to another person. Right, so there's this really good quote from James Rachels here. So the requirement of impartiality then is at bottom nothing more than a prescription against arbitrariness in dealing with people. It is a rule that forbids us from treating one person differently than another when there's no good reason for doing so. But if this explains what is wrong with racism, it also explains why in some special cases it is not racist to treat people differently. Suppose a filmmaker is making a movie about the life of Martin Luther King Jr. He would have a perfectly good reason for ruling out Tom Cruise as the starring role. Obviously, such casting would make no sense because there would be no good reason for it. The director's quote-unquote discrimination would not be arbitrary and so would not be open to criticism. All right, so this is a pretty good explanation of what it means when there's a morally relevant difference. So just, blanket, saying, oh, it's always wrong to treat someone differently because of their race. It's no, it seems like in this instance, it was okay to treat someone differently because of their race. But there's this morally relevant difference of, it's also a pragmatically relevant difference there of you're casting a role of a person for a race and for a particular situation. And so that's explaining what a morally relevant difference is right there. We'll talk about morally relevant differences more as we go along. All right, so the fourth feature of moral norms is reasonableness. our moral norms should be backed by reasons. So, these are reasons that are going to be able to also withstand scrutiny. So they're going to be able to help us distinguish like true moral norms from our like knee-jerky reactions or our feelings, which can sometimes be misleading. Now, our feelings and emotions are not always misleading. They can help us empathize with others, deepening our understanding of human suffering, and they definitely give us insight into our moral decisions. But still, feelings and immediate like emotional reactions sometimes like merely reflect our own psychological needs or our own personal or cultural biases or reflect our own personal advantage. So the moral life is about using and questioning and generally interacting with the norms that are going to be marked with these 4 distinctive characteristics. So again, the 4 characteristics are normative dominance, universality, impartiality, and reasonableness. So we can apply these norms to our lives in 2 possible ways, through like our moral obligations and through our moral values. So our moral obligations or our moral duties are, we would apply morality about how we're acting or how we should be behaving. In this realm, we use theories and rules and principles to help guide our actions. We can also apply these moral norms through our like moral values. So our moral values are connected to our moral judgments, about something being good or bad, or praiseworthy or blameworthy. So we often use these words, good, bad, praise, blame, when we're talking about a person or their character or, their motives for doing something. For example, he's a good person, she's honest, she did wrong, but she didn't mean to. So these are all ways, we talk in that moral sense. Sometimes we also use the word good, though, in a non-moral sense. Like, for example, you might say, like, oh, that's a good bicycle. But what you really mean is like that's a good functioning bike. It's a well-functioning bike. It doesn't have some moral character that we're talking about here. So strictly speaking, getting back to some of this vocabulary, ethicists like to use right and wrong when they're talking about actions, and they like to use good and bad when they're just talking about like describing people or their character or things like that. So you can kind of remember this. Maybe this is helpful through this little phrase of good people can sometimes do wrong and bad people can sometimes do right. Okay, so we maybe also judge an action to be right or wrong based on a person's motives. So, for example, if someone were to push someone so that person is out of the way of a moving car, it makes sense to say that's a morally acceptable reason for pushing someone. Whereas, like, if you just push someone because you dislike the color of their skin, that seems like a clear, like, morally unacceptable reason for pushing someone. Okay, so generally, I think most people understand what it means for something to be right or wrong. Sometimes there's this gray area, but I think there are also, like, degrees of rightness or wrongness, specifically that we are going to be using in this class. So obligatory means that it is wrong not to perform it. So it means you have to do it. It's obligatory. It's wrong not to do it. Okay, so permitted means that it is not wrong to perform. So you don't have to do it, but it's not something you have to do. It's not obligatory. It is allowed. It's permitted. Okay, so wrong means that it is prohibited. It means that it's wrong to perform. It means that you're obligated not to do it. Now there's this other term. It's called supererogatory. It's a weird ethicsy term. I think it comes from like Latin and or Greek about duty, and then it's beyond duty is what I think the meaning is there. So supererogatory. So the meaning is supererogatory means that it's good to do, but it's not required. Another way of thinking about this means that it's doing the action is above and beyond what's called for in that situation. So sometimes people mix up morality and the law. Sometimes morality and the law are, coincident, but for the most part, morality is distinct from the law. So the laws are norms that are enacted and enforced by the state to protect and promote public good. They specify which actions are legal, are legally right and legally wrong. The same actions might be judged as morally right or morally wrong, and these two judgments don't necessarily always have to agree with each other. So some actions are immoral, but depending on the society you live in, they might not be illegal. For instance, lying to a friend about a personal matter, or deliberately destroying yourself through reckless living, or failing to save some drowning child even though you easily could have. Things like racial bias or discrimination based on gender or sexual orientation. Things like slavery or spousal rape. Unequal treatment of minority groups. These are all things that, depending on what society you're in, they might be legal, but they probably aren't morally acceptable. So nonetheless, the law and morality do overlap, a fair bit of the time, maybe most of the time. So what is legal is often immoral, especially when the action could cause substantial harm to someone else. Whether it's physical, actual, like bodily harm, or something more like financial harm, like stealing money or something like that. So, for instance, things like murder or embezzlement are both illegal, but also both immoral. So, controversy then tends to arise when people think that an action is immoral, but it doesn't clearly cause someone else harm, and they want to make it illegal. So there is a controversy because regardless of the lack of harm, they want it to be illegal just because they believe that it's immoral. So this is an idea known as like moral legalism. If you want to get into that, definitely take like a philosophy of law class. But so in this class, we are definitely going to be covering topics that have both a legal and a moral dimension to them. So just try and be aware and sensitive to that fact. That sometimes we're going to be talking about the moral realm, sometimes we're going to be talking about the legal realm, and sometimes we're going to be talking about both. In bioethics, there are 5 main principles that are going to be used, and we're going to go over all 5 of them here in this section. These moral principles are going to be derived or supported by the moral theories that we're going to go over in the next lecture. So there are 2 ways of thinking about principles. There are absolute principles. These are principles that apply in all cases without exceptions. And there are prima facie principles, applying unless exceptions are warranted. So principles being prima facie, allowing for this exceptions and things like that, will help resolve issues when there are conflicting principles. So when 2 prima facie principles conflict, we should follow the one that's weightier, the duty that, it carries a little bit more weight, more importance. So the main principles that have been very useful so far in biomedical research are generally autonomy, non-malfeasance, beneficence, utility, and justice. And now we're going to go over each one of those in turn. Autonomy is a person's rational capacity for self-determination or self-governance. In other words, it's the ability to direct one's life and to make choices for oneself. So this principle comes to us from deontology, which we'll go over in the next lecture. And the idea is that people have intrinsic worth because they have the rational capacity for self-determination, which means that we should not violate their autonomy by ignoring or thwarting their ability to choose paths and make their own judgments. So we should never violate a patient's autonomy, but there are some rare exceptions. So instances of violating a patient's autonomy is, conducting a medical experiment on a patient without their consent, treating a patient against their will, physically restraining or confining a patient for no good medical reason. So those are all going to be examples of violating a person's autonomy. So autonomy is about making decisions and being able to do so freely. So for a person to really actually, express their autonomy and not have it violated or thwarted, they need to be given all relevant choices, which means that we need to fully inform someone in order to not violate their autonomy. So this gives us a reason to think that lying is wrong. Basically, the idea is that lying violates someone else's autonomy. It is limiting their path in some way, their choices. So in bioethics and the law, it's clear that we need to have patients' informed consent. This means to make sure that they freely consent to the treatment, or they freely consent to declining a treatment, and ensuring that they receive relevant information about the decision, and they're able to make an informed decision. Okay, so autonomy is a pretty fragile thing, and it can be compromised by other people, but it can also be compromised by other factors, such as like the society someone was brought up in, or maybe exactly how you were brought up in that society. It can also be connected to genetic things that can undermine someone's autonomy. So someone who is an addict, or a person who suffers from serious mental psychological illness, or has severe mental impairments, but then also children. These are people who are not considered to have full autonomy, and so then a lot of bioethical issues are just going to arise around cases with these patients. Okay, so autonomy is going to be a prima facie principle, which means that it can sometimes be overridden. The other main principles that conflict with autonomy is the principle of harm. So autonomy can be limited to prevent harm to other people. So we were talking about this earlier. It could be financial or bodily physical harm. So for example, to discourage hospitals and healthcare workers from hurting patients through carelessness or fraud, laws and regulations limit what they can do to people in their care. But then also to stop the spread of a deadly contagious disease, health officials can quarantine a person against their will. So another principle that conflicts with autonomy is paternalism. This is the idea that we should override certain people's actions for their own good. So we'll talk more about paternalism in the lecture on patients' rights. But generally there are two forms of paternalism, and some are more acceptable than others. So first, the forms of weak paternalism, things like suicide prevention, are generally seen as acceptable. Whereas in contrast, things like strong forms of paternalism, like giving someone a life-saving treatment without their consent, are generally considered unacceptable. Still, these are considered violations of someone's autonomy. So non-malfeasance is a principle that you might know by the colloquial phrase of first do no harm. So it can be stated a little bit more precisely as we healthcare professionals should not cause unnecessary harm to people in our care. So this is a very basic bedrock principle of bioethics. Someone might violate this principle, if they're deliberately causing harm to a patient, by giving them a drug that they know is going to cause them a heart attack. That's a clear violation of not causing them harm. But then they also might violate this principle by, injuring a patient through their reckless actions or negligence or, inexcusable ignorance, like they should have known better. So throughout the course of medical treatment, it can be really difficult, if not impossible, to, avoid harm altogether. Avoid causing any suffering or injury to the patient. Instead, healthcare practitioners should practice what's known as due care. This means that they have a duty to act reasonably and responsibly to minimize harm. So further, even if the treatment doesn't result in harm, subjecting a patient to unnecessary risk seems to violate this instance of due care. So there might be two treatments, but one carries a little bit more risk than the other. And there doesn't seem to be any more actual benefits, then giving that patient that course of treatment seems to be exposing them to unnecessary risk. even if they don't die or nothing happens, like it still seems like this violates the principle of non-malfeasance. Okay, so the principle of beneficence is just one of the principles that seems to be like really like the center and the core of like morality in general. So the general sense of this principle is, you know, that it can be stated as like we should do good to others. So more than the last one, more than non-malfeasance, we should promote the well-being of others and also remove harm to them. So this seems like a clear duty for most medical professionals. You know, it's kind of it's a duty that comes along with the occupation. Although it doesn't seem to be, although it is a basic duty of medical professionals, it doesn't seem to be a duty, you know, for ordinary people. Rather, you know, exactly how much good should we do towards others all the time? You know, that's something that, you know, is going to depend on which ethical theory you're going to appeal to. But generally, most people think that the principle of beneficence is a little bit above and beyond the call of duty. It could be considered a supererogatory duty for most, in most circumstances. Yeah. So the principle of utility, according to this principle, we should produce favorable balances of good and bad for, you know, everyone who's involved. So we should really be using this principle because in the real world, we can't always just do good and avoid harm. Instead, you know, we need to balance the good with the bad. Ultimately, utility is, you know, not one of the main principles we should be using, but it is a supplement to the other two. So it shouldn't just be the only one we're using, but it should be used in conjunction with the other ones. This principle is one of the defining principles of the theory of utilitarianism, which again we're going to cover in the next lecture. But still, the principle is like generally widely used in bioethics. For instance, when, you know, a caregiver is deciding between two courses of treatment, or, you know, two actions, they're going to use the principle of utility to balance the good and the bad. So also public health officials are going to use the principle to create, but then also evaluate policies that are used at institutions and, you know, by governments and society at large. So with that, you might like be thinking about like vaccine policies or something like that. So, but then also public health officials are going to use the principle of utility to determine, you know, how and where to direct the money and, you know, the funding for research, things like that. All right, so finally here we have the principle of justice. Justice can be hard to identify, but injustice is usually a little bit more obvious. Mostly because most of the time people are just. And so, you know, we don't notice it all the time, but then when something, you know, goes wrong and someone is treated clearly wrongly in front of us, like we are like, oh, that's unjust, that's wrong. So it's a little bit, you know, more obvious to identify and things like that. But generally the idea behind justice is fairness, or sometimes people think about it as like, you know, getting their, you know, just dessert, or, you know, getting their due. So justice seems to come in two main forms. There's retributive justice, which is, you know, it's the idea that a just punishment is a cause for, or you know, a response to, you know, someone doing something wrong. It's retributive justice. That's the idea. But then also that these punishments are going to deter others. Okay, so then like we have distributive justice. That's another form or way of thinking about justice. Distributive justice is how society's benefits and burdens should be distributed fairly. So bioethics, in distributive justice, you know, bioethics is often thought about with regards to questions about healthcare and how healthcare should be distributed. You know, who should get it, how much should they get, and, you know, who should be paying for it. So the basic idea behind the principle of justice is that equals should be treated equally. So unless there's a morally relevant difference, you know, everyone should be treated the same. We talked a little bit earlier about morally relevant differences, and we'll talk more about it as we keep going along. So different theories explain, you know, what aspects, you know, in what ways equals should be treated equally, in terms of, what metrics or what things we should be considering, and what is morally relevant and what isn't morally relevant, or what's the most morally relevant or a little less important. Okay, so with theories of justice, we can break these down into three main buckets. First, we have libertarians. So they're going to emphasize personal freedoms, markets without interference from governments or others. They think of the government as a night watchman, and it is, the government is only responsible for providing, is not actually responsible for providing healthcare at all. Rather, no one is entitled to healthcare on the libertarian view of justice, and individuals are only entitled to what they can acquire. Okay, so then we have an egalitarian approach to justice. So this is the idea that a just distribution is an equal distribution. We should treat people equally means that we should have equal access to minimum goods and services, which means that some individuals' liberties are going to be restricted. I'm not completely sure exactly what it means to be restricted. This is how libertarians define egalitarian views. But I think generally what they would mean here specifically is that some people would have to pay more for other people. So their options, I guess, are restricted because of the price. Prices start becoming prohibitive, and then it causes them to have to rethink other aspects of their life. And so yeah, I think that's how it's infringing on their freedoms and limitations and things like that. Okay, so then according to the egalitarian view, minimal health care would be available to everyone. Okay, so then there's a middle ground here between different, theories of justice. Something like a healthy respect for autonomy, but it also allows for limited government interference and government support and things like that. There might be a mandate that the basic needs of at least the least well-off are taken care of. So these are the basic minimums that I think most people could agree on, at least. More than just the minimum libertarian of everyone's entitled, or no one's entitled to healthcare at all, versus the egalitarian approach, which is more everyone's allowed. Okay, so we'll actually get more into this in the chapter on healthcare. Look forward to talking to you guys about that, and yeah, see you guys later.